opinions are cheap and proof is gold. I'm Mark Huber, and this is The Proof Point, a show from User Evidence that helps go-to-market teams find ideas, get frameworks, and swap tactics. In 2025, every B2B marketer needs to be focused on one thing: building trust. So I went to the toughest industry to pull that off, cybersecurity, and talked to 6 of the best B2B marketing leaders to learn just how they're doing it. On today's episode of The Proof Point, I'm joined by Mary Yang. She's the CMO of Syxsense. No, not that Syxsense, the cybersecurity Syxsense. Mary and I dove into what really happens behind the scenes of cybersecurity marketing, whether it's layoffs, acquisitions, navigating tricky leadership dynamics, and bouncing back from campaign missteps. She's seen it all. She shared the hard lessons she's learned throughout her career and was very vulnerable about some of the career-defining moments that shaped how she thinks about marketing. I love this combo. Enjoy. All right, so Mary, I have to break this to you. You realize you're on The Proof Point, not that Slurps.
Unfortunately, yes.
I don't even think I really know the full story from last night, but we had a dinner that we co-hosted with Novatic, and Ray, who's here and one of the co-founders of User Evidence, kind of yelled across the table and said you had a podcast idea. So let me hear the actual idea and I'll tell you if it's good or not.
Sure. So this is hilarious. We were actually brainstorming activities and sort of next projects for Brandon, Brandon Ho, who I love and adore. And he was saying, he's working on some things. And I said, hey, have you seen those YouTube videos where they're just slurping noodles and you're just watching people eat and slurp noodles?
Yep.
And he was like, yes. And so we had this whole idea about, he could run a new project where he's slurping noodles, all kinds of noodles, but also brainstorming. So it's a noodling while noodling podcast / video series.
I would subscribe to that.
Right? I feel like it's pretty cool. And then, that slurps was Kelsey LaBelle's fabulous tagline.
Yes.
So now we're all about slurping.
That's amazing. All right. Well, I guess I'll have to keep my eyes out and see if that actually comes to life sometime in the next couple months. So I very thankfully got to sit through your panel earlier today. And before we get into the actual panel and some of the things that you talked about and really landed with me, I would have not been able to guess that you were dealing with a little bit of chaos right before the panel. What were you working through as a CMO?
As part of the integration efforts, today was the day that the IT team basically merged our Outlook accounts. And so one of our salespeople, for some reason, his HubSpot got completely sideways and he was emailing out of our customer support email, and then prospects were emailing back, but it was going to the customer support inbox instead of him. And so I was got on this thread with 7 different people, including the IT teams. And it was like, Mary's going to have to deal with this. And I'm thinking, why do I have to deal with this?
Well, and then you're probably less than an hour until your panel started?
Oh, no, that was literally 3 minutes before the panel started. And I was like, okay, I'm going to shoot off this email. Also, I'm getting on stage. I will be back in an hour.
Well, it was an awesome panel. There were, I think it was 3 different CMOs, marketing leaders, and a moderator talking about just really career lessons and kind of horror and war stories over the years. So I'm excited to talk about a few of those. I'm relatively new to cyber marketing in general. This is the first time that I've been at Cyber Marketing Con. I've learned so much in the 2 days that I've been here, but I think one of the things that I've really learned is that marketing to buyers in cyber, they're a very skeptical and delicate bunch. So how would you talk about and describe cyber buyers?
I definitely think the skepticism is true. I would probably push back a little bit on the delicate piece. I think it's that they get inundated, right? There was a panel earlier today where there's discussion about sales and marketing alignment and being more empathetic to the person, on the other side of the table. And I think the same is true for the buyer, right? If I think about that buyer, they're in these high pressure roles oftentimes. When things go awry, they have to be on, and they have to sort of at the drop of a hat be like, oh yeah, that random alert from a log that came online 7 days ago was XYZ, and here's all the things that I did to immediately counteract what was happening. So I think there's empathy there. And I think that the skepticism that they have really stems from, they've got all of these things they're being asked to do. There's all of these vendors out there saying, we can solve your problem, we can solve your problem, we can solve your problem. And I work for a vendor, I work for a technology vendor. At the same time, I recognize, like most people on the buying side, that it's not just tech that's going to solve the problem. And so
I love that answer.
There's also just like all of that comes into play, right? And I think that's all part of what drives that skepticism and makes it difficult, really, for marketers to kind of break through the noise, because once you get 50 vendors doing this, like they just write them all off.
I love everything that you said in that answer. What have you seen work well when marketing to those buyers to really build trust and confidence? And I think everything that you mentioned is for good reason too. It's not like they're being, unrealistic.
Yeah. So I think that there's a couple things, right? Certainly I'm a big proponent of content that is useful. And what is it that you can give and sort of provide to your target audience that's going to feel tangible and real to them. Certainly every company I'm with, they're like, oh, we sell to the CISO and we need to be super high level and all of that jazz. And I just don't know that is really the end game. This top-down approach sometimes works, depends on the industry, but oftentimes it's the folks who are like day in, day out, hands on keyboards that you really have to convince. And I've worked in organizations where that line of sort of middle managers, I mean, they're the ones holding it all together, right? They're the ones that are stopping all of the stuff that's flowing, all the random great, CEO listens to McKinsey podcast and now you have to do X, Y, Z.
Oh no, that never happens. Yeah.
Those middle managers are stopping that from getting to the front lines of people who are actually needing to do the work, and vice versa. If they find something that they think is not cool, they're just going to shut it down. And so for that group, what can you offer that's meaningful? I think back to when I was working on some cyber threat intel. I was working for a cyber threat intel vendor, and Russia invades Ukraine. Sort of the world goes crazy. And we had all of this intelligence around critical infrastructure. And you could see what was happening with Russia and Ukraine. You could see where Russia was using sort of IT and cyber attacks to go after Ukrainian critical infrastructure. And you had all of these IOCs. So what we did was we looked at, well, do any of these IOCs and TTPs match what could happen here in the United States? What does it look like for, a mapping of potential IOCs to a malicious actor that would attack the U.S. energy grid? And then we pushed out a report saying, hey, here's the areas within the United States with these particular critical infrastructure sectors that might be vulnerable in light of all of this stuff that's happening globally, and maybe we should do something to shore that up.
I've lived and kind of worked in a MarTech bubble for the last, 4, coming up on 5 years, and the stakes of buying, the wrong MarTech tool, relatively speaking, are fairly low. Maybe your personal role is on the line, but as a cyber buyer, the stakes that you just described, it is like an order of magnitude, probably 5 orders higher, because these are serious consequences.
Yeah.
It really puts it into perspective. Yeah. So maybe let's get back a little bit to the panel that you were on this morning. And it was about war stories and, basically career learnings that, if you were to give advice, the good advice and maybe things to not do to your younger self, these are the things that you would do. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is just the highs and lows of being a marketing leader at a cyber startup. So what are some of the highs and what are some of the lows that you've had to deal with?
When you're running a campaign and it goes really well, you kind of, my general rule of thumb is everyone wants marketing to be a science, but it's like this quasi-science, it's not really science. There's a lot of numbers. Yes, I believe in numbers. They're important. But at the end of the day, you're going to run a campaign and you're going to put a stake in the ground and say, I think I'm going to do X, Y, Z. This is the ROI I'm going to get. Whether or not that happens, you can certainly put parameters in place to measure and hopefully get there, but it's kind of just a crapshoot. You're just kind of making it up. And so when it actually happens, when you can pull off a campaign that really hits the numbers or exceeds the numbers, that's amazing. You just feel so good about it. And I think that there's a lot of those examples. And I think that's when maybe marketers ride a high, right? I would say there's aspects like that where it's oh, you're just doing your job well and you're exceeding your goals.
All right, now the lows.
In general, I think the lows end up being about like people more than anything else, right? And when I say people, I also mean things like culture and, the environment. What I've sort of run into is just coming into an org and realizing like, oh, like there's just a lot of morale issues maybe, right? I'm coming in at a time, I joke a little bit with like Gianna. We joke about like, hey, when a new CMO comes in, it's because things aren't going well. It's kind of like when a new sales leader comes in, it's because things aren't going well. And whether that's true or not true, like that's kind of the feeling. And so you walk into this space where like morale is low and you have to figure out, why is morale low? Is it about, the individuals themselves? Is it about the work that they're doing? Is it about the company culture? Is it about the way that the teams are structured, the collaboration or lack of collaboration, all of those aspects? And that's the hardest piece. Like everything else, the tech stuff, the operational process, even like creating campaigns.
It's really like none of it to do with like actual marketing.
Yeah, it's really just all people management. Like that is going to be the hardest thing.
So during tough times like that, how do you keep people motivated and, keep them up as opposed to feeling down? It's not easy.
So I think there's a couple of things. Like I want to be as transparent as possible about the strategy, where I think things should go or need to go. And I think like being very clear, very direct about it, and making sure that everyone knows what's expected of them, right? Like that's a big thing, is especially in moments of change, people are like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing or not doing. So I'll be like, here's this, here's the broad strategy, here's the goal. This is the goal you're going to have to work on hitting. And we can talk through how you do that. We can talk about all of the ideas that you might have to get there. I'll give you some ideas too. And then like, let's go off and try it. But I think that's a big one. And then letting folks know that they're valued, their contributions are valued. I think that's a big piece too. Just being willing and open to listen, right? I joke right now, and every once in a while I've shown my team like my calendar where I'm like quadruply booked at times throughout the week. But when a team member pings me on Slack and says, hey, can I get 15 minutes? I'm like, let's find 15 minutes. It doesn't matter that I've got 4 meetings I'm supposed to be in right now. Like, let's have a talk. If you think it's important to talk, I'm making the time.
I love that. Now, a lot of what you just talked about, I feel like you may have had to go through recently, because aren't you working through an acquisition right now?
Yes. Yep.
So maybe share just some of the things that you've been working through and have kind of learned by way of this process.
I definitely think things like that, just being open, being direct about where I want the team to go, the goals that are going to be set forth in front of them. And I think just like feedback along the way. I'm asking these team members that I'm sort of inheriting to do things and exercise muscles that they haven't necessarily done before. And I think part of the thing that is so interesting to me is like people will come and say, I need 10 minutes, and then they'll say, I don't know if I'm doing this right. And I'll say, walk me through your logic, right? Like tell me how you got to this. And at the end I'll be like, yeah, that all sounds good. Like maybe the numbers aren't where we want them to be, or maybe that isn't the way that we want to approach things moving forward. That's okay. I understand that this is where you got to. We're going to move on from here, right? We'll iterate, it'll be better. And I think those things hopefully have helped with a bit of that integration overall and kind of moving things forward together.
So you mentioned numbers, and it wouldn't be a panel at a marketing event without talking about numbers and attribution and reporting and whatnot. So one of the things that you said on the panel I loved, and it was when you were talking about attribution, and I think it was a hypothetical question where the CEO is asking about something, and then you had a great answer back to the CEO, and you didn't give an answer. You really asked the question. And what was that question?
Yeah. So the CEO was pushing for, multi-touch attribution. And I said, hey, let's look around the table. How many of you C-suite individuals book a demo from an email that hits your inbox from marketing? And not a single one of my counterparts at that table raised their hands. And in fact, the CEO was like, nope, I don't. I like delete the email. I'll go to DuckDuckGo. I'll like do some research in a way that you can't follow me with any cookies. And then, I might tell someone else to reach out if I'm interested in learning more, so that I'm not giving away my information.
Yeah.
And I'm like, of course, this is why multi-touch is a very difficult thing to do.
So I don't want to talk about attribution, mostly because it's boring and I don't want to get you all riled up, but there's I think a fair degree of education that needs to take place at your level with other people on the leadership team who probably don't know as much about marketing as you do. So what have you learned by way of having to educate your peers and even the CEO on just what you're doing in marketing with your team?
There was a point earlier in my CMO journey where I would get really just sort of defensive, and
I'm in that kind of stage right now in my marketing leader journey. So
I'd get defensive,
yes.
and I'd be like, look, you hired me as the expert. Can you just trust what I'm telling you?
Yep.
That was very early on. And I think I realized over time that it's not actually about trust or not trust, right? The job of the CEO is to make sure that the company as a whole is on the right path. And so they're going to ask the questions. They're going to poke around. If things aren't great, they're going to poke even more, right? It's all a little bit of like spot testing or temperature checking. And sometimes that education really needs to happen multiple times. I think about the sort of advertising thing about like, you have to see the same message like a dozen times for it to stick. And what I've realized is that happens also from marketing and education to your C-suite peers and your CEO. Sometimes it feels like Groundhog's Day with the same message.
I literally wrote that exact bullet in my notes and said, it feels like Groundhog Day, and it's critical to educate the leadership team over and over and over again on topics like attribution.
Yes. And other things like, the demand model
Yep.
or brand. I mean, there was a panel earlier where someone was talking about like, if you go into a CMO role and all they care about is demand gen, like that's a red flag. And it's interesting because as silly as it sounds, it feels like all of my CMO roles have been about demand. But I come in and I'm like, if your exit strategy is this, which is typically to get acquired, you can't do that without a brand.
Yep.
No one's buying a know-nothing company. I shouldn't say no one, but like most big orgs aren't buying a know-nothing company. And so brand has to become a component.
I love that. So one of my favorite things that you said on the panel was your response to what is the biggest success story from your career in cybersecurity marketing. Do you remember what you said?
I did.
Can you talk about that story?
I said that I successfully negotiated a 1-year contract with a unnamed analyst firm that everyone loathes. I can talk about it a little bit. I've actually done this a couple of times now, and I'm probably going to be put on a list.
I think I'm already on that list. Yes.
But I understand in some ways I can sympathize with where this firm is coming from, where they want multi-year contracts in place. But at the end of the day, especially if you're a startup, it just makes no logical sense to get locked into a long-term contract, especially if, again, the goal is to exit within a certain number of years, right? And so I've been able to a couple of times now work through this negotiation process where if you start the conversation sort of early enough with your rep, the trick is you do a sort of cancel rewrite. And instead of doing what is essentially a 1 year, you're doing a 18-month renewal, and then it looks like it's a multi-year and sort of passes a sniff test. But ultimately, I think my biggest negotiation tactic is just that you have to be willing to walk away. And if you're not willing to walk away from that relationship, then there's no negotiation tactic that's going to work. And I was telling some folks on the way to dinner last night, my big thing is I really love negotiating with vendors. I love it.
Did you get a start in procurement or something, or where does this come from?
I don't know.
You're the first person that I've met that's not in procurement that has said that.
I don't know what it is. I think it's just that I'm very outcome driven. I typically am working with very small budgets on the marketing side, and so I'm looking for every way to stretch that dollar. I also got a PR sort of measurement tracking software technology. I'm not going to name 1 year down to $4,000 for an annual subscription.
Can I hire you to negotiate for us or what? Yeah.
Yes, you can. I'll moonlight on the side.
Oh my gosh. So one of the other things that really stood out to me in the talk was the piece of advice that you gave to your younger self, and it was about really the need and power of advocating for yourself. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
I mean, when I started my career, I was just willing to sort of take any job, right? I had student loans. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I was an English major and I wasn't going to become a teacher. And so, things kind of went sideways because I thought I was going to become a teacher. And I just started working, and in that first job, sort of 2 years went by without any cost of living adjustments or any raises, even though I thought I was doing good work and I was being told I was doing good work. I went to my next job and I didn't negotiate, and it was awful overall. But I realized that, everyone else around me was making considerably more than me. And so it wasn't probably until the third job that I had in my career where I was like, okay, I need to negotiate. And I mean, I would get I was getting sweaty. I had
been there.
Was so nervous, right? I thankfully in that one, the hiring manager didn't pick up the phone. So I was I just left a message. It's probably rambling, hurried message. And
I'd love to hear that voicemail later.
Yeah. And then I hung up and I was like, oh my God, what happened? Yeah. And it was fine, right? There was a bit of negotiation and life moved on. With the fourth job, that was the one where I lost a part of my soul. I worked all the time. And when I say that, I was emailing with the CEO at 1 a.m. That's what was for 5 years of my life. I gave everything to this company and was just thinking oh, they'll recognize my value and they'll promote me and they'll get me where I need to go. And ultimately none of that happened. And I wish I had known, that might have been 10, 11 years into my career, I wish I would have known that, yes, hard work is important and it pays off in a lot of ways, but no one's going to advocate for you the way that you do.
So that is an incredible lesson to learn at any point in your career. How does that play out today? Because you still need to advocate for yourself.
I think I get to be in a really privileged position, and I've said this to a few people in my life recently, where I don't need my job, and I realize that is a luxury. And so in a lot of ways for me, the advocacy is around my team and the people that I think do really good work, and making sure that they're given the opportunities to grow, that they're being given appropriate salaries and recognition. That's really the big thing for me, is making sure that all of those folks that I rely on to kind of keep things moving and helping to meet company goals, that they're taken care of.
So asking for a friend, aka me, this is the first time that I'm in the seat of a marketing leader and hiring and growing my own team. So how do you go about those conversations with your team to kind of know what's important for them and what you need to advocate for?
I think it's just questions, right? It's what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do? Do you have a clear sense of that? And if you don't, that's totally okay, right? You don't have to. I think one of the things that on the panel, my two panelists, Joy and John, said were, you don't necessarily have to climb the ladder. If you really love product marketing, you could be a great product marketing leader and not be a CMO, right? So I think that's absolutely acceptable. And I think that's one thing that we probably should say more of. I'm not 100% sure that I would choose to be a CMO again if I were doing my life over. But I think that it's having those conversations with your staff, offering them the option to explore other areas. One of my roles early on, I got my start in content marketing, and then I ended up doing straight execution, sort of demand marketing. And it was really helpful, but I was also I kind of missed the content piece. And I just chatted with my boss and said, hey, if there's an option to do some content, if there's some ability for me to do that while taking care of all the rest of my stuff, I'd love to just keep my toes in that bucket a little bit. And she was like, great. Yes, and having those conversations and making sure that your staff know that they can have those conversations with you, that's important.
So you mentioned the word execution, and this was a bullet that I'm looking at in my notes right now from the panel this morning. And what you said, and I love this, strategy without execution is absolutely meaningless.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
My story was I talk with folks who are younger in their career, and they're like, I want to do strategy. And the thing is, that's exactly what I was like 15 years ago. Was I want to do strategy. What do you mean I have to write this newsletter, right? And I realized as I've gotten more experience that you can think up of the most brilliant strategy in the world, but someone has to do something with it. Otherwise, it literally means nothing. It's just words on a PowerPoint slide.
I
or
worked
in
at
a
Accenture for 2 years.
Yeah.
I'm very familiar with what
See?
you're talking about.
Exactly,
Yes.
right? I mean, and management consulting is a perfect example
Yes.
of this, right? And so at some point, I think you both have to, especially if you're in the startup world, if you're developing the strategy, you have to have an understanding as a leader of what it's going to take to execute that. And your team has to have an understanding of how they can execute to help drive that strategy forward. They can absolutely be part of that process, right? And developing that strategy or developing the execution of it in broader terms. That's all fine and good. But at the end of the day, like, marketing is about doing things, getting things done, getting things moving. And so I often think, like, great, like, strategy is fabulous. What are we doing to actually drive things forward?
Yeah, and I feel like earlier in my career, I was thinking, how can I get promoted faster, or how can I stop doing the actual work? And I'm a first-time VP of marketing right now. I still enjoy doing the actual work. Yes, I do enjoy the strategy part and getting to do the things that I've always wanted to, but I wanted to be that type of VP of marketing that is still getting into HubSpot, is still, like, doing the actual marketing. I just find straight up people management as being really boring and not really what I want to do.
But it's also, like, the hardest part of the job.
Absolutely.
So I'm like, oh, if I need to upload a list to HubSpot, like, let me go do that instead of dealing with this, like, HR nightmare over here. Like, that's the thing I would choose to do. Right? I'll write a blog any day of the week if I can avoid like having to deal with, hey, your performance isn't great. Let's work on this.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the hard conversations.
Not the fun stuff.
Yeah.
So to wrap everything up, the fun stuff, what are some of the big things that you're thinking about as a marketing leader for next year? We're almost, at the start of the new year, and I'm currently in the thick of planning right now.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had a better answer.
And you don't have to give away the secret sauce.
Ultimately, I don't know that I think that there's a ton of secret sauce. Cyber marketing it's this whole ecosystem in and of itself. But I think you've got the big events, you've got the, like, digital tactics, you've got, like, ABM you could be running. I feel like it's a little bit of all of those things. I don't know that there's a silver bullet. If anything, it's about, to me, I think for next year, the biggest challenge and the biggest potential win is, for my organization at least, like, really being able to set ourselves apart, improve brand awareness. Those things go hand in hand.
Yep.
And then making sure that that's in service of a larger goal, which is to drive revenue and drive pipeline and demand, right? And ultimately, it's a little bit of all the potential tactics that get you there. I was listening in on a influencer panel at the conference.
Yep.
And it was interesting because my takeaway was cybersecurity influencers can be great if you have a bad product, and you have to be, as an organization, you have to be willing to potentially get roasted. And I'm like, oh, maybe influencer marketing is not quite the right thing at the moment, but that is the one that, like, if there was any tactic out there where I'm like, oh, it'd be interesting to explore, might be that one.
So for me personally, I've done some influencer work myself outside of the cyberspace, but I think what's cool is there's been this evolution from the start of this year, a lot of companies asking to do paid posts, and the volume of requests that I was getting just went up and up and up. And now it feels like it's getting away from just the, hey, will you post this for X dollars, and more, hey, you have a following in our ICP, we'd like to partner with you, let's create some sort of 3 to 6 month partnership where you are kind of involved in our marketing, doing different things, not just, trying to post as a megaphone on LinkedIn. And it's been really interesting to see that evolution firsthand. So I'm curious if that came up at all in the talk.
I think there was a little bit of that in the talk. It was, these sort of longer partnerships versus a bit of one-offs. And that's, I think, what influencers would prefer, so that they get a little bit of time to get to know the company that they're partnering with. It was also, if the company that they're partnering with, at the end of the day, they're like, oh, you're not the real deal.
Yep.
Like, they're just going to say that.
Yeah. And what it sounds like is cyber buyers, more than anyone, are able to sense that right away.
Yeah.
I mean, they know their stuff.
Yep. 100%.
I love it. Mary, this was awesome. Thank you so much for coming on The Proof Point.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Proof Point. If you like what you heard during this conversation, you probably will like Evidently, my bi-weekly newsletter where I share my biggest hits and get honest about my misses as a first-time VP of marketing. You can subscribe using the link in the show notes here in this episode. The Proof Point is brought to you by User Evidence. If If you want to learn more about how our customer evidence platform can help you build trust and close deals faster, check out userevidence.com.